Welcome to Mindful Moments.
Okay, so imagine this. You're the ambassador for your country, right? During the Cuban Missile Crisis, literally the closest we've ever gotten to nuclear annihilation, and you don't even know your own government is putting missiles there.
It's almost unbelievable, but that was the situation for Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador here in the U.S.
Exactly. And his memoir, In Confidence, it gives this just incredible inside look at the Cold War. He was here for 24 years.
24 years. Think about that. Across 6 U.S. presidents, Kennedy, all the way to Reagan. That kind of continuity is, well, it's incredibly rare in diplomacy.
It gave him this unique perspective, didn't it? Seeing the whole sweep of superpower relations, the crises, the thaws. Today, we're really going to dig into some key moments from his time here.
Looking at how communication worked or sometimes how it really broke down.
And we'll also touch on what we call mindful moments, those points where even in the thick of conflict, some kind of crucial understanding seemed to emerge.
That long view Dobrynin had really lets you see those moments, those shifts in thinking over time. It wasn't just one crisis after another. It was this ongoing, very complex relationship.
So let's start with Cuba, the missile crisis. The fact that Dobrynin himself was initially out of the loop. What does that tell us about how the Soviets made decisions back then?
It really underscores how centralized and compartmentalized things were in Moscow. The decision to put missiles in Cuba was clearly made by a very small group, maybe even just Khrushchev and his closest circle.
Keeping their top guy in Washington completely in the dark.
Exactly. Talk about a precarious position. He's supposed to be representing Soviet policy, but he doesn't even know what the most critical policy is. It shows the intense secrecy, maybe even paranoia, at the top.
But despite that huge disadvantage, he ended up playing an absolutely critical role in winding things down. Those secret meetings with Robert Kennedy, they're almost legendary now.
They are. And they highlight the power of the Backchannel, especially in a crisis.
Why was that unofficial route so important right then?
Because the official channels were just frozen, full of public posturing and accusation. The late-night talks between RFK and Dobrynin allowed for direct, really candid exchanges.
Cutting through the noise.
Precisely. They could clarify intentions, float compromises, figure out what might actually work without having every word scrutinized publicly. It built a sliver of trust, just enough to find that off-ramp. It shows how personal connections, even between adversaries, can be vital.
And one very concrete thing came out of that near disaster, the hotline, the direct line between Moscow and Washington.
Yes, their famous red phone, although it was actually a teletype machine initially.
Right. It seems obvious now, but it took staring into the abyss to make it happen.
Absolutely, and that connects to your idea of a mindful moment, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Both sides had a terrifyingly clear realization. Miscalculation could lead to catastrophe. They needed a reliable, immediate way to talk, leader to leader, no matter how bad relations were otherwise. It was a shared imperative born from shared danger.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Fast forward to the Nixon years and the beginning of détente. This is another fascinating period, especially the role of the secret back channel between Nixon, Kissinger, and Dobrynin.
It really is quite remarkable. Nixon, the career anti-communist, engaging in this deep, secret dialogue with the Soviet ambassador.
What made that possible? It seems so unlikely on the surface.
Well, Nixon and Kissinger were, above all, pragmatists. They saw the dangers of unchecked nuclear competition. They also saw potential advantages in stabilizing the relationship, maybe even leveraging it regarding Vietnam.
And Dobrynin was the key.
He was the perfect conduit. He'd been there for years, he knew the players, he had credibility, and somewhat ironically, Nixon's own preference for secrecy and controlling things tightly actually helped this back-channel approach. It bypassed the State Department bureaucracy, which Nixon distrusted.
And this secret diplomacy led to some major breakthroughs, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was instrumental in laying the groundwork for Nixon's historic visit to Moscow in 1972. And, crucially, for the SALT-I Treaty, the first real agreement to limit strategic nuclear weapons.
So they hammered out the basics in secret first.
Exactly. They ironed out a lot of the sticking points through Dobrynin before the big public summits and negotiations. It made those more formal events much more likely to succeed.
Dobryn's portrayal of Nixon in the memoir is quite nuanced. He saw him less as the rigid ideologue and more as a pragmatic statesman.
Yes, and that's a valuable insight. Dobrynin interacted with him over years, saw beyond the public persona. He recognized Nixon's strategic thinking, his grasp of power politics, and even a genuine concern, believe it or not, about avoiding nuclear war. It's a complex picture.
Détente itself, though. Dobrynin points out that the U.S. and the Soviets never quite agreed on what it actually meant, or what the goals were.
That's a critical point. Détente wasn't one single thing. It included arms control like SALT, agreements on basic principles to avoid confrontation, increased trade, cultural exchanges.
But the interpretations differed.
Significantly. For the U.S., it was mostly about managing the superpower competition, making it less dangerous, particularly the nuclear aspect. For the Soviets, they hoped it meant more acceptance of their status as an equal superpower, maybe a decrease in ideological conflict, and, frankly, access to Western technology and trade.
So those differing expectations were bound to cause friction down the line.
They absolutely did. Each side often felt the other wasn't living up to the spirit of détente as they understood it. That divergence really contributed to détente starting to fray later in the 70s.
Which brings us to the Carter administration. Carter put a huge emphasis on human rights, and that seems to have really thrown a wrench into the works with Moscow.
It absolutely did. For the Soviets, Carter's public and persistent focus on human rights inside the USSR felt like, well, like a direct attack. It wasn't just interference in their internal affairs as they saw it. It challenged the legitimacy of their entire system.
How did Dobrynin describe Moscow's reaction?
He writes about their confusion, their frustration. They didn't really understand this shift. Previous administrations had focused more on traditional power politics, arms control, geopolitics. Suddenly, human rights was front and center.
And it wasn't just rhetoric, it started impacting other areas, right? Like arms control.
Precisely. The Carter administration began linking progress on SALT II, for example, or on trade issues, to improvements in Soviet human rights practices, like allowing more Jewish immigration.
So everything got tangled together.
It made negotiations incredibly complicated. Things that might have been agreed upon previously now got bogged down by these linkage politics. It created significant new obstacles and really cooled the relationship. It shows how deeply differing values can impact diplomacy.
Then we swing back again with the early Reagan years. A real return to confrontation, the evil empire rhetoric, the military buildup. Dobrynin sounds genuinely alarmed in his account of that period.
He was. And you can understand why. From Moscow's perspective, this looked like a deliberate, dangerous escalation. The rhetoric was harsh, the defense spending was massive. There was real fear about U.S. intentions, perhaps even fear of a first strike.
And deep mistrust on both sides, it seems.
Oh, absolutely. Mutual misperceptions were rampant. The Soviets saw Reagan as reckless, while the U.S. administration saw the Soviets as relentlessly expansionist and untrustworthy. Dialogue really seemed to almost break down completely for a time.
But then something changed. Reagan's stance seemed to soften or at least evolve. And then Mikhail Gorbachev arrived on the scene in Moscow. How did that shift happen?
It was a combination of factors. Inside the Reagan administration, people like Secretary of State George Shultz were pushing for renewed dialogue, arguing that simply not talking was too dangerous.
Pragmatism again.
To some extent, yes, and a recognition that maybe the harsh rhetoric had served its purpose. But the really decisive factor was Gorbachev. He came in with completely new thinking, as he called it.
What did that mean in practice?
It meant realizing the Soviet Union couldn't sustain the massive arms race economically. He needed to reduce international tensions, to focus on desperately needed domestic reforms, perestroika and glasnost.
So his priorities shifted.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
And this created an opening. Reagan, perhaps surprisingly to some, showed flexibility. He was willing to engage with Gorbachev. It's fascinating, actually. Channels like Mindful Moments and our podcasts, which analyze audiobooks and history, often point to moments like this, shifts driven by changing internal dynamics meeting external opportunity. Dobrynin's memoir really captures that evolving potential.
It's like the stars aligned, in a way. Two leaders willing to move beyond the old stalemate?
In a sense, yes. Gorbachev needed détente for domestic reasons, and Reagan, perhaps seeing a chance to achieve real arms reductions and maybe even end the Cold War, was willing to meet him partway.
Throughout all these ups and downs across decades, Dobrynin seems to have relied on some core principles in his diplomacy. What were they?
Well, one thing that comes through strongly is the importance he placed on personal relationships. Building trust, even with adversaries like Kissinger or Vance or Harriman. He believed that was essential for communication.
Getting beyond the official talking points?
Exactly. He also emphasized pragmatism over rigid ideology. He was representing the Soviet system, of course, but he focused on finding areas of potential agreement, managing the conflict. And he stressed understanding America, not just the government, but the society, the politics, the culture.
That must have been key to his longevity and effectiveness. balancing loyalty to Moscow with credibility in Washington.
It was an incredible balancing act, and he seems to have managed it better than almost anyone else could have for such a long period.
His story really does give you a sense of the sheer complexity of Cold War diplomacy. It wasn't monolithic. It was full of these shifts, these back channels, these personalities.
Absolutely. His memoir is such a valuable resource because it shows the messy reality behind the headlines. The constant probing, the misunderstandings, the attempts to connect, the vital role of communication or the lack of it.
It makes you think, doesn't it? Consider how those lessons from the Cold War, especially, the absolute necessity for clear communication, for trying to genuinely understand the other side's perspective, even when you fundamentally disagree, how might those apply to the global challenges we're facing right now?
That's a really crucial question to ponder, isn't it? In a world that's maybe even more complex now, with multiple power centers and new kinds of threats, what can we take from Dobrynin's experience about navigating dangerous international currents? Something for all of us to reflect on.
If you found this look into Anatoly Dobrynin's world interesting, definitely subscribe to our show for more explorations like this one.
And please share it with anyone you think would appreciate this kind of historical deep dive.
To really get the full picture, you can grab a copy of Anatoly Dobrynin's In Confidence. Check the show notes for a link.
As always, we encourage you to think critically about everything we've discussed. Consider the perspectives, the historical context, and draw your own conclusions.